They say the Addington house was just a home, just bricks, windows, and silence. But silence can lie. What happened behind their curtains was never spoken, only felt, and what remains isn't a ghost. It's something far more disturbing. If you think you know fear, think again. Subscribe now and join me as we uncover the truth no one dare to speak. Because some families don't die, they echo. The first time I heard the name Addington, I was only 7, sitting on the back porch of my grandmother's house in Dunsmore, a town so still it felt like time had forgotten it. My cousin Lily had dared me to walk past the estate after dark, claiming the house itself would whisper your name if you stood close enough. But even as a child, it wasn't fear that stopped me. It was the look in my grandmother's eyes when she overheard our game, a look that didn't belong to someone amused by children's ghost stories, but to someone who'd lived through something so crushing, so intimate. It stripped her words, and all she managed to whisper was, "Don't go near there, not ever," before turning away, trembling, not out of age, but out of memory. That moment etched itself into me like an ember burning through the skin of my childhood. And now, decades later, standing on the cracked pavement outside the Addington gates with nothing but a rusted key and an obligation to sort the remains in the state no one wanted to claim, I realized Dunsmore hadn't moved on. It had calcified, fossilized into a shape of collective denial, a town that dressed its fear in politeness and silence, one that pretended not to notice the way the wind changed near the Addington property, or how the grass never grew evenly along the western fence, or how even now, children still cross the street rather than pass too close. The house stood 3 stories tall, veiled behind a gate of iron filigree and overgrown ivy, its windows like blind eyes, watching without watching, the curtain in the 3rd window on the left drawn halfway, as though someone had left mid-glance and never returned. And as I unlocked the gate, the hinges screamed like they remembered, and I found myself wondering not why the family fell apart, but why no one had ever tried to put the story back. Together, the last Addington had died 3 months prior, some distant cousin I never met, and by bloodline technicality the house now belonged to me, though the weight it carried was anything but legal. Stories like these, tragedies left to rot in silence, don't pass on through paperwork. They pass through blood, through the marrow of generations too afraid to ask questions. And as I stepped into the front hall, the air held a temperature that didn't match the summer outside, and I felt something not watching but waiting, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for someone not to uncover its secrets, but to remember them, to pull them out like splinters and scream. Because no one ever screamed when it happened, they just closed the doors tighter, whispered prayers into dry lips, and taught their children pretend. I knew pieces of it, fragments from old newspapers yellowed with time, obituaries without photos, a fire in the summer of '82 with no official cause, police reports that mentioned domestic unrest without elaboration, but nothing painted a full picture, only a collage of pain carefully arranged to hide the truth behind carefully chosen words. And I thought about the people who lived here, children raised behind curtains that never opened, a father known only by his signature on utility bills, a mother whose last photo was a wedding portrait from 1969. And I wondered what kind of love could decay into silence so completed. Swallowed names, swallowed screams, swallowed every part of life except the structure that held it together, and I knew then that the story I came to uncover wasn't about hauntings or curses. It was about something more chilling. The kind of pain that doesn't want to be buried but understood. The kind of tragedy no one could see from the outside, because it wore the mask of normalcy too well. The Addington home wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by memory, by choices, by decades of secrets suffocating behind silk drapes and dinner etiquette. And as I touched the wallpaper, peeling in long strips like skin, it felt alive beneath my fingertips, as though it remembered the palms of children who pressed against it while being told not to speak, not to cry, not make a sound unless spoken to. I found a light switch, and the bulbs flickered to life, casting a jaundiced glow across furniture covered in white sheets like corpses in morgue. And for a moment I hesitated, hand still on the switch, because part of me, irrational maybe or intuitive, was terrified not of what I might find, but what might recognize me, what might remember me. Because blood is memory, and the Addingtons were my blood, no matter how thin, no matter how distant. And the house, somehow, knew that, welcomed, embraced it like a prodigal child come home not to inherit, but to reckon. I stepped into the sitting room and felt the first crack in my certainty when I saw the photo on the mantel. For faces staring back, unsmiling, stage, with a kind of stiffness that didn't come from posing but from fear. 2 parents and 2 boys. One slightly older, taller, standing with his hand protectively on the younger's shoulder. But it wasn't the composition that unnerved me. It was the eyes of the older boy, a sharpness in them not born of curiosity but of vigilance. The eyes of someone who didn't trust the photographer or the room or the man standing beside him in a suit one size 2. Big. And I felt that ember again, the one from my childhood, sear a little deeper as I realized. I hadn't come to solve a mystery. I'd come to reopen a wound this town never let heal. The Addington house didn't sit on Mercy Lane. It brooded over it, hunched like a wounded animal at the very end of the road, where the asphalt thinned into gravel and the trees grew too close to the path, their branches heavy with silence. Even in daylight, the property felt untouchable, as if the sun itself avoided, spilling its warmth over the rusted gates or the once pristine garden now devoured by ivy and rot. And as I stepped deeper into grounds, every breath I took carried the scent of old mildewed dry earth and something subtler, more intimate, like wilted roses left too long in a sealed room. The gravel crunched beneath my feet like brittle bones, and I imagined the countless footsteps that had crossed this very path decades ago. Children shuffling home from school, the mother returning from one of her rare whispered outings, the father stride heavy with finality. But now nothing moved, not even the wind, and the silence pressed against my skin like damp linen, thick and unrelenting, as if the house itself was holding its breath again, this time waiting not to be remembered but to be judged. The front door loomed larger now, its once polished oak warped by weather and time, brass handle dulled by neglect, and I hesitated for a beat, not out of fear but reverence, because this wasn't just a house. It was a mausoleum of memory, and to step inside felt like violating something sacred, even if what was buried here had long since turned sour. When I finally pushed the door open, the groan of wood against rusted hinges echoed to the vast, stale interior, and I was met not by darkness, but by a dim haze of gray light filtering through dust-choked windows, illuminating a hall frozen in time. The wallpaper, once cream with delicate gold florals, now yellowed and peeling in long curls. The floorboards groaning beneath my steps like they recognized an unfamiliar rhythm. And the air, oh God, the air felt old, dense with the breath of generations who'd spoken too softly and cried behind closed doors. The entrance hall gave way to a grand sitting room, the one from the family photograph, and now, stripped of illusion, it was both more tragic and more terrifying than any ghost story I'd ever heard. Sheets still draped over furniture, as if the family had fled mid-conversation. Picture. Frames hanging askew, one completely shattered on the floor, its glass buried in a dusty rug. And in the fireplace, a single unburned log sat waiting, the ashtray beneath it long cold. I peeled the sheet off the nearest armchair, revealing cracked leather beneath, and sat, just for a moment, to let the weight of the house settle into me, because I needed to understand, not from a distance, but from within, what it must have felt like to grow up here, to live under the rules and silences and invisible boundaries of a family so profoundly fractured became invisible to the town around it. I imagined the boys, Robert and Theo, pacing this very floor, perhaps told not to run, not to laugh too loudly, their mother seated nearby with her hands trembling just enough to rattle the teacup she never drank from, and their father, ever looming, correcting posture and behavior with a sharp look or a single, curt word, a man whose presence was more force than flesh, moving through the rooms, felt like peeling back scabs, each space revealing more of the decay beneath the skin of formality. The dining room, with its long table and 12 high-backed chairs, sat untouched, the table still set with dusty plates and tarnished silverware, as though a meal had been planned but never served. And I saw it all, how each seat had its own gravity, the mother nearest the kitchen, the boys at opposite ends, and the father at the head, commanding silence with a glance. I could almost hear the clink of forks placed too gently, the stifled coughs, the way no one dared speak unless prompted, and even then, only in rehearsed pleasantries. I found the kitchen next, smaller than I expected, cramped and utilitarian, as if warmth and hospitality had been banished, leaving only the function of nourishment without the comfort of care, and on the far wall, I noticed small pencil marks just above the doorframe, faint but unmistakable. The kind parents make to mark their children's heights over. The years. Only these were different. The lines grew more irregular the higher they climbed, the names beside them scratched out violently, then rewritten in different handwriting. And I stood staring at those marks longer than I meant to, feeling the weight of invisible hands pulling me backward in time, showing me flashes of arguments just out earshot, tears never allowed to fall, smiles that vanished the moment a door creaked open. Upstairs, the hallway stretched impossibly long, lit only by a cracked skylight at the far end, casting fractured sunlight across the faded carpet, and each door I passed bore a brass plate with initials etched into them, R-A-T-A-M-A, and one with no plate at all. Its was darker, the knob heavier, and I knew without knowing that this was a father's room, the one no child entered without invitation, and maybe not even then. I pushed open the door marked T.A. first, Theo's room, and was struck by its simplicity. A narrow bed, a single bookshelf, with worn copies of adventure novels, a desk covered in old composition books and neatly stacked pencils, and a window with a curtain pinned shut, the light blocked so thoroughly that the air inside felt like it hadn't moved in years. I opened a drawer and found dozens of handwritten notes, each dated, each carefully folded. Messages to himself, perhaps, or to someone who never read them, and I pocketed a few, not out of greed but necessity, because I needed to hear his voice to understand. How a boy grew into a name no one spoke anymore. Robert's room, by contrast, was chaos. Drawers open, paper strewn across the floor, books torn apart and thrown against the walls, as if someone had ransacked it, or more likely he had. An explosion of emotion no one had stopped, no one had acknowledged, and in the center of it all, a broken music box lay with its ballerina figure snapped off at the waist. The tune box still functional, but too warped to play anything recognizable, only a haunting warble of notes like a lullaby underwater, and I could almost see him there, fists clenched, face red, tears not of sadness but of rage, and I wondered what he was trying to drown out, what truth his fury was trying to expose. The master bedroom was last, and stepping into it felt wrong, as though the air turned heavier the moment I crossed the threshold. The bed was perfectly made, sheets tucked hospital tight, an antique mirror facing the door, its glass fogged with age but still, reflective enough to catch my silhouette, and beside the bed, a nightstand drawer half open, revealing a revolver and a stack of photographs, each one labeled, dated, some with red excess drawn through the faces, and I stared at them, at the cold arithmetic of someone keeping score, and felt the first real tremor of fear, not supernatural, but human, because this wasn't the work of madness, but a method, a man who saw his family not as people, but as components of a system he alone controlled, and in that moment, I understood what the town had never said aloud. The Addingtons didn't fall apart. They were dismantled piece by piece, and the man responsible was revered for his discipline, respected for his intellect, even pitted in the aftermath as a victim of unforeseen family tragedy. And no one had asked the children, no one had listened, and the silence that followed was not out of confusion but complicity. I left the bedroom and walked back downstairs, not because I was finished, but because I couldn't breathe. Every room had a voice, and they were all screaming in whispers, begging not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement, for someone to say out loud what had been denied for decades. And as I stood once more in the entry hall, beneath the chandelier with 2 missing bulbs, I knew the house hadn't been waiting for me to discover its secrets. It had been waiting for me to feel them, to let them burrow into my chest until they ached like they belonged there. And I felt them all, the loneliness, the quiet terror, the endless waiting behind drawn curtains, hoping someone would knock, someone would notice, and when no one did, they turned inward, folding themselves into roles they couldn't escape, into versions of themselves shaped not by love, but by survival. And now, years later, it was my turn to walk these halls, to carry their weight, to face the truth not buried in the walls, but in the spaces between them, in the dust on the piano keys and the silence, between floorboards. And I realized with painful clarity that I hadn't come here to write a story. I'd come here to finish one that began long before I was born and wouldn't end until someone had the courage to listen, really listen, to what had always been whispered just behind the curtains. They say photographs capture the soul, but the Addingtons' family portraits seemed to do the opposite. They drained it, left only the outlines of people who once smiled for the sake of appearance, but never for joy, And as I stood before the large oil painting hanging crooked above the staircase, a commissioned portrait, I presumed, I was struck by how it almost seemed unfinished, not in the technical sense, but in its hollowness. The faces were there, accurately rendered, postured in stately elegance, the two boys seated before their parents like carefully placed accessories. But there was no light in their eyes, no trace of familial warmth, just a strange, clinical distance, as though the family had been assembled for the image, but never truly existed as a unit. And the longer I stared, the more certain I became that this wasn't a portrait of love. It was a display of control. It haunted me down the hallway as I turned into the old study, a room that reeked of cigar smoke and leather polish despite years of abandonment, and I imagined the father, William Addington, seated behind a massive mahogany desk, dictating order with a glance, his presence so heavy it stained the air, and I found myself brushing my fingers over the spines of old books on psychology, philosophy, military, strategy, every one of them annotated meticulously in the margins, not with ideas but corrections, as if he was not reading to learn but to refute, to dominate, to control even the thoughts of authors long dead. The deeper I looked into his things, the clearer the portrait of the family became. William, the patriarch obsessed with legacy and discipline, Margaret, his wife, once a violinist with offers from orchestras abroad, now reduced to the silent hostess of a crumbling household, her dreams, folded and pressed into the linen drawer like one of her monogrammed napkins, and the children, Robert and Theo, each shaped not by who they were, but by who they were forced to become to survive their father's iron expectations. Robert, the elder, groomed to succeed, praised when obedient, punished harshly when he questioned or faltered, and Theo, the quiet one, sensitive, more prone to disappear into books or the garden, who learned quickly that visibility meant vulnerability. I found Margaret's journal tucked inside the lid of the old piano bench, its pages brittle, the ink faded but still legible, and I sat on the cold wooden floor to read, breath shallow, heart quickening with every entry. Early ones were filled with hope, her handwriting rounded and smooth, notes on the boys' first words, the color of the kitchen curtains, the way William once looked at her during dinner. But soon, the words turned clipped, phrases repeated like mantras. Keep your voice low. The boys are watching. William mustn't know. And then, near the end, entries devolve into fractured sentences, rushed and barely coherent. Robert at the razor again. Theo's drawings. Why all the locks? I miss the music. I miss myself. And the final entry, dated just weeks before the supposed accident that took Robert's life, read only, I fear what he's become. I fear what I've allowed. The fire's already burning, and I can't find the matches. And I closed the journal with trembling hands, realizing this was not a mother documenting life, but a prisoner confessing quietly to an invisible witness. I wandered next into the boys' shared bathroom, still lined with faded tiles of seafoam green. A child's attempt at joy now dulled with mildew, and I caught my own reflection in the streaked mirror, eyes hollow, mouth dry, the look of someone not uncovering secrets, but becoming them. And I remember my grandmother's whispered stories, the way she would cut herself off whenever the Addington name came up at family gatherings, her hands gripping the table edge like it could anchor her to the present. And I understood now that this fear was not about ghosts or curses. It was about remembering what everyone else had agreed to forget. I moved then to the attic, the narrow stairwell groaning with each step as though protesting the intrusion. And when I reached the top, I found a room neither dusty nor abandoned but arranged meticulously, ritualistically, as if someone had been using it right up until the day the last Addington died. Toys placed with surgical precision on a shelf, old clothes pressed and hung neatly, and a single bed, perfectly made, with a folded note on the pillow addressed to Mother, its contents chillingly plain. He still comes in at night. I pretend to sleep. I know what happens if I move. I think Robert is gone. He doesn't answer anymore. Please let me leave. Please. I sat there for a long time, the letter in my lap, trying to piece together the fragments of family imploding not from sudden tragedy, but from slow, meticulous erosion, love drained into obedience, laughter replaced with fear, and childhood traded for survival. And I wondered how many times Margaret had walked past this attic door, hearing her son whisper to the darkness, knowing she could do nothing or worse, choosing to do nothing because survival in this house meant complicity. Back. Downstairs, I discovered a charred section of the basement wall hidden behind a false bookshelf. A crude patch job of drywall and mismatched paint masking a fire long since extinguished, and in that moment, the phrase, family portrait in ashes, took on new meaning, not as metaphor, but as fact. Something had burned here, something the fire department never reported, something scrubbed from police records and left only in smudged newspaper clippings about an isolated incident and unfortunate. Electrical faults. And I ran my hand across the uneven wall, wondering who started the fire, what it was meant to destroy, and whether anyone had died in the blaze or simply been erased by it. And still, through it all, the silence of the house pressed on, not empty but full of memories trapped in walls, of screams muffled by distance and indifference, and I realized that every room, every hallway, every carefully framed photo and staged piano bench was part of the same machine, one. Designed not for living but for containment, not for expression but for erasure. This house was not built for family. It was built to hide what a family became when its foundation was control, fear, and silence. And I knew then that the Addington legacy was not scandal or rumor. It was a quiet genocide of spirit, a slow smothering of self, and the ashes it left behind were not the result of fire, but of years of repression combusting in a final, desperate cry for release, one that no one heard or chose to hear until now, until me, and I felt their voices gathering behind my ribs, not as ghosts, but as memories waiting to be named. IT was in the smallest room, what must have once been a linen closet wedged between the master bedroom and the stairwell, that I found them, bundled tightly in a rotting shoebox, wrapped in a child's pillowcase and wedged behind a panel of warped wood that had started about outward, as if the house itself had grown tired of keeping the secret. The box was heavy, with dampness, its corners eaten away by time and insects, but inside, stacked in trembling layers of yellowed paper and curled edges, were letters, dozens of them, each one folded with a kind of obsessive care that only a frightened child could manage, the ink faded but legible, the handwriting small and urgent, uneven in places, as though written in haste or secrecy or both, and each one addressed to no one in particular, some beginning with "Dear Friend," or "Dear whoever finds this," while others were simply pages of thoughts, confessions, desperate inquiries scrawled without greeting or signature, and I sat there on the dust-choked carpet, knees folded, the smell of mold and aged paper thick in the air, and read until the light outside shifted from gold to gray. The first letter was short, 5 sentences of unbearable loneliness from Theo, written when he was barely 10, describing how the windows in his room were nailed shut, how the birds he could once hear from his bed had gone silent, how his father stopped speaking to him after he asked what happened to Robert's dog, and how his mother, when she tucked him in, smelled like burnt fabric and garden soil, her hands too cold for summer. "I think she's fading," he wrote, "like the curtains, and I don't know what to do." And I paused there, the weight of that single sentence anchoring in my chest, not just the despair of a child, but the recognition that the adults around him were crumbling, and he had no language for it, no way to ask for help except through these secret pages. The letters became longer as I read on, and more detailed, a gradual unveiling of A, household collapsing behind a veil of order. Theo wrote about rituals. Dinner at precisely 6:30, no second helpings, no speaking unless addressed directly, shoes to be polished every Sunday and lined up at the base of the stairs, even if no one was leaving the house, and every curtain drawn before dusk with no explanation, just a rule, absolute and final, and he hated the curtains most of all, described them as breathing things, their floral prints too alive, said they whispered when he tried to sleep, though he didn't think they were haunted, just filled with the sound of the house, soaked into fabric like smoke. One letter shook me more than the others. A full 4 pages detailing the day Robert stopped coming downstairs, how their father claimed he'd been sent away to a boarding school, but Theo overheard the shouting the night before, the sound of furniture breaking, his mother's muffled sobbing to the wall, and then silence, complete and punishing, and when Theo knocked on Robert's door the next morning, there was no answer, only the faint smell of kerosene, and he wasn't allowed near that side of the house again. "I don't believe he left," Theo wrote. "I think he's still here, but he's hiding, and I think Father knows." Each letter built upon the last like puzzle pieces from 1,000 different boxes, some written in despair, others with eerie calm, almost clinical, cataloging days of silence, meals skipped, bruises unexplained, and eventually pages. that shifted in tone completely, becoming philosophical, reflective, as if Theo had matured faster than life allowed, forced to reconcile not only his isolation but the realization that no one was coming to save him. Not the neighbors, not the extended family who stopped visiting, not the teachers who sent polite inquiries when he vanished from school, and certainly not the mother who had long since become a ghost who cooked. One letter, dated late autumn, stood out not because of its content, but because it was the only one clearly meant for someone specific. "Dear Robert," it began, "if you're still here, if you're reading this, I forgive you. I know you had to do what you did. I know Father made you. I just want to know if it hurt. I want to know if you felt sorry after. I think I heard you last night. I think you tapped the wall twice like we used to. If that was you, do it again. Please do it again." There were no follow-up letters to suggest the wall ever tapped back, and I sat there staring at that page for what felt like an hour, imagining Theo crouched in his room, ear pressed to the drywall, heart thudding in hope and terror, begging for a reply that never came. The emotional devastation in these letters wasn't loud. It was creeping, quiet, a slow disintegration of a child's trust in the world. And reading them felt like intruding on something sacred and shattering at once, like watching someone drown in shallow water while the world turned away. Scattered between the letters were drawings, charcoal sketches of the house, always from odd angles, with strange shadows at the windows, one depicting the dining room with one chair engulfed in black scribbles, another the basement door surrounded by what looked like scratches or claws, but on closer inspection were tiny hands reaching out, dozens of them, stretching from the margins toward the doorframe, and then, buried, near the bottom of the box, a final bundle tied with string, these letters different, written not by Theo, but by someone else, the handwriting older, tighter, more rigid, and at first I thought perhaps they were from Margaret, but the voice was different, colder, more clinical. These were notes, records, a kind of observational journal with dates and behaviors. Theo did not respond to questioning. 2 hours without food initiated. Emotional deviation observed. No signs of rebellion. And mother remains unresponsive to reconditioning. Further silence may result in removal of privileges. And I realized with a sick twist that these were the father's writings, his documentation of control disguised as care, a scientific approach to domination that stripped his family of agency and reduced them to experiments, to behaviors to be corrected, and I felt my skin crawl with the knowledge that the house wasn't just a home. It was a lab, a prison, a place where love had been dissected and replaced with obedience, and all the while, the town said nothing, did nothing, allowed the Addington legacy to rot in peace because silence was easier than confrontation. I put the letters back in the box with shaking hands, knowing that reading them had changed something fundamental in me, that I could no longer look at this family as tragic figures in the faded photo, but as real, breathing people, broken, terrified, and ignored, and that I, now holding away their last words, carried a responsibility I hadn't asked for but could know. Longer deny. This wasn't just a story, and I wasn't just a curious heir. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with the kind of horror that lives not in shadows but in daylight, in manners, in rituals, in families that smile in public and bleed in private. And as I left the room, the light now fully gone from the sky, I felt something inside me begin to fray. Not fear, but grief, old and ancestral, and I knew the next step wouldn't be uncovering the truth, but facing it, and that whatever waited in. The deeper corners of this house wasn't just history. It was consequence, still breathing, still waiting to be acknowledged. The realization didn't come as a scream or a gasp. It came in a whisper, in the quiet cracking of a name spoken aloud in the wrong context, in a detail so small it should have meant nothing, but instead shifted the entire foundation beneath me. I had gone to Dunsmore Historical Society that morning, hoping to find property records or archive school enrollment logs that might explain the year Robert Addington disappeared. But instead I found a yearbook from 1984, brittle and sun-bleached, its cover peeling like old paint, and as I flipped through the pages, the truth emerged not in absence, but in misplacement, because both Addington boys appeared in the photographs, but the names had been switched. The boy I had always believed to be Robert, the confident, tall, sharp-eyed older sibling, was listed as Theo, while the smaller, softer-faced child with a withdrawn expression was labeled Robert, and at first I assumed it was a simple editorial error, until I noticed it again in the class roster, and then again in a medical release form filed under the town's outdated but meticulously kept pediatric records, and the truth finally hit me with the force of grief and betrayal colliding midair. The wrong brother died, or more accurately, the surviving brother took on the name of the one who didn't, and everything I thought I understood about the Addington legacy twisted violently. The letters, the journals, the silence. They all reshaped themselves through this new lens, and the implications hollowed me out. The boy who stayed, the one who wrote desperate pleas behind locked doors, who listened for taps that never came, who asked questions no one answered. That was Robert, not Theo, and the child who vanished, who was said to have been sent away, was not the fragile younger brother, but the one who bore the weight of expectation, the one being molded into a replica of their father, and for reasons still unclear. When he disappeared, the surviving child became him, claimed the name, wore it like armor or perhaps like penance, and lived in his shadow so completely that even their mother stopped using his real name, or perhaps was too broken to notice the difference anymore. I returned to the house in a trance, the air outside thick with summer's humidity, but I couldn't feel it. The heat, the ground beneath my feet, the passage of time, because the truth moved through me like anesthesia. Wearing off after a wound has already been stitched, revealing pain that had always been there, but was only now fully felt. I entered the study again and began tearing through drawers I hadn't searched before, finding a box beneath the desk labeled medical, confidential, and inside, among old prescriptions and evaluations from school counselors, was a handwritten note from Margaret dated October 2nd, 1984. He won't respond to Robert anymore. He looks at me like I betrayed him. William insists it's best for everyone. Says the name doesn't matter. The behavior will follow. But I see the way he flinches when his brother's name is spoken, the way he mimics Robert's posture in the mirror. He's forgetting who he is. Or maybe he's choosing to. And beneath that, a note from William in tighter, angrier script. Identity is mutable. Weakness is not. I will not tolerate regression. I dropped the papers as if they burned me, heart hammering, hands cold. Because this wasn't confusion. It was transformation, forced and strategic, a reshaping of one child into another, erasing the lesser identity and replacing it with a favored son, and whether it was done out of punishment, necessity, or something far darker, the effect was irreversible. I turned into the hallway, retracing my steps to the bedrooms, and stood between the doors marked R.A. and T.A., the initials now, meaningless, or perhaps more sinister in their deception, and I entered both again, this time not to see where each boy lived, but to understand what was allowed to survive and why. Robert's room, or rather Theo's, had been turned upside down, torn apart, a mirror of rage and loss, while the other remained neat, curated, a museum of memory frozen in time. And I thought of the letters again, how they'd changed over time, how Theo's voice had become more analytical, detached, increasingly cold, as if the boy had begun to detach from emotion altogether. And now I understood. Those weren't just letters from a child growing up in isolation. They were the writings of someone losing themselves in real time, someone being reprogrammed, reshaped, rewritten into a role they had not chosen. And the horror wasn't just that it happened, but that no one stopped it. Not the mother, not the teachers, not the town that pretended not to see the bruises, or the shifting identities, or the way the boys' names were no longer spoken publicly. And then the question that had been forming all day finally bloomed into full horror. What happened to Theo, the real Theo? There was no boarding school, no hospital record, no obituary, just a name that stopped appearing in documents after the fire. And I remembered the patch of basement wall hastily repaired, the scorched frame, the smell of kerosene described in the letters, and my stomach turned violently, bile rising in my throat, because I knew that something terrible happened in that house, that a child had died, and the body was not mourned but erased. And worse, the surviving brother had been forced, or coerced, or manipulated, into stepping into that absence and wearing it like a second skin. I descended into the basement, flashlight trembling in my grip, and faced the scorched wall again, the drywall poorly fitted, the studs behind it clearly newer than the rest of the foundation, and I didn't need to open it to know what had been hidden there. Maybe not a body, but evidence, a memory too damning to be left in plain sight. And I imagined the scene, a confrontation, a fire, the father, cleaning up the aftermath with cold precision, and a terrified child being told, "You are Robert now," as if it were that simple, as if pain could be overridden with performance. This wasn't identity theft. It was identity obliteration, and I suddenly saw the entire house as a stage for that performance. Each room a set, each family photo a lie, each relic a prop meant to reinforce a version of reality that only one man controlled. And I wondered if the boy who lived, Robert, born Theo, had ever truly forgotten who he was, or if he simply buried the truth so deeply inside himself that it became unrecognizable, even to him. I stumbled out of the basement and into the hallway, heart pounding, mind reeling. It was then that I noticed something else subtle but unmistakable. The light in Theo's room had changed, not brighter or dimmer, but colder, as if the sun had withdrawn itself from that space entirely. And I entered cautiously, flashlight sweeping across the walls until it landed on something I hadn't noticed before, a name carved into the underside of the windowsill, small and shallow but clear. Tick, still here, and beside it, scratched later and deeper, but not for long. The room spun, the letters blurring as the weight of everything settled into place, and I dropped to my knees, pressing my hand to the carving, feeling the grooves beneath my fingertips, and I wanted to weep, not just for the boy who vanished, but for the boy who stayed, who had to live every day as someone else, whose memories were not comfort but cages, who was told his real name didn't matter, and who, in his final act of resistance, left behind a single, aching message. He hadn't forgotten, not really, and maybe that was the worst fate of all, not to die, but to live erased. The official letter arrived on a rain-heavy Thursday morning, printed on thick paper with a watermark I didn't recognize, and sealed in an envelope that felt too formal for what it contained, a quiet, understated legal declaration that I, by blood and circumstance, was the sole remaining heir to the Addington estate. There was no flourish, no sentiment, only the sterile assurance of transfer, an inheritance not of wealth or comfort, but of silence, heavy, ancient, impenetrable silence. And the moment I read the last line, all assets, property, and historical liabilities, the weight of those final two words buried itself in my chest like stone, because nothing about the Addingtons was ever simple, and now their legacy, whatever twisted, half-buried thing it was, belonged to me. I sat in the kitchen of the old house that night, rain tapping against the stained windows like it was trying to get in, and laid. The letter beside an old teacup I hadn't dared move since I arrived, as if touching it would erase something sacred, or worse, invite something back, and I couldn't stop staring at the word liabilities. Not in the financial sense, but in the emotional, in the ancestral, in the echo of choices made by people I had never met, but whose blood coursed to me now like a whispering river. Margaret's silence, William's cruelty, the boy's confusion, erasure, loss, all of it funneling down into me, like smoke curling from a chimney long thought cold. I began sorting through boxes in the back room, not out of curiosity, but out of obligation, a compulsion to inventory the ghosts I now owned, and found more than I expected. Legal files, old letters from town officials politely inquire about school absences, invoices for repairs of the basement marked discretion requested, and a curious file labeled behavioral logs. Pages of notes clearly written by William Addington himself, tracking the emotional responses of his children like test subjects. Day 14. Subject shows reduced reactivity to external stimuli. Emotional flatness may be a sign of success. And beneath it, note, must recalibrate consequences to encourage fear-based compliance. And reading felt like looking through a microscope at a disease that had somehow gone dormant, waiting for a new host. And I realized with nauseating clarity that this house wasn't just a tomb of the past. It was a mechanism designed to perpetuate its own sickness, to replicate its silence, and now, by law and blood, it had chosen me to continue it, and I didn't know whether to scream or run or surrender. The townspeople hadn't spoken to me since I arrived, not with words anyway, but their eyes followed me, their posture stiffened when I passed, and I noticed how they crossed the street or turned their backs slightly when I entered the store, and I understood then that the Addington name still held weight here, not as a curiosity, but as a warning, a scar the town wore just beneath its surface, and I resented them for it, for knowing and saying nothing, for protecting themselves while two children were rewritten and one was lost entirely. And now they looked at me not with blame, but with dread, like I might reopen a wound they'd buried decades ago. In the upstairs hallway, I found a lockbox wedged behind a linen cabinet, sealed with rust and effort, and when I finally pried it open, I found the will William's own hand, scratchy and deliberate, stating that the estate must remain in family hands to ensure continuity and preservation. And I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the idea of preserving this place, this graveyard of names and forgotten identities, was so grotesque, so arrogant, that laughter was all I had left. But what chilled me most wasn't the will. It was a letter tucked beside it, addressing me by name, though it must have been written long before I was born, and the handwriting wasn't William's. It was Margaret's, frail but unmistakable, and in it she wrote, "If you are reading this, you have come back. I don't know who you are, only that you are the last. I want you to understand something. This house is not evil. It is not cursed. It is broken. We were broken, and we didn't know how to fix ourselves. If you have the strength to look carefully. Not everything was as it seemed. I tried. I truly did. But trying wasn't enough." And her words tore something open inside me. Not pity, but profound sorrow. The recognition of someone who had lived with unbearable guilt and no way to express it. A woman who loved her children but couldn't save them. Who watched one vanish and the other disappear in plain sight. And now here I was, trying to make sense of it all, to piece together a story written in silence. And I felt as though I was failing her too. I moved through the house like a wraith for days, barely eating, sleeping on a sofa in the parlor because the bedrooms felt too intimate, too loaded with memory, and I began to notice patterns. How the light only entered certain rooms in narrow bands. How the house seemed to breathe with temperature shifts I couldn't explain. How at 6:30 p.m. every night, the pipes in the wall clicked 3 times, like an echo of a dinner bell that no longer rang. And I started keeping a journal, not because I wanted to write, but because I feared. Forgetting, I feared that the silence might seep into me, overwrite me, as it had done to the Addingtons. And so I wrote everything. The smell of old cedar in the wardrobe, the way the wind pushed against the third-floor windows but never rattled them, the fleeting sound of the door creaking when no one else was there, all of it, every detail. Because the only way to combat silence was with record, with voice, with truth. And I wasn't ready to speak it aloud yet, but I could write, I could, document. And maybe that would be enough. But in the quiet hours, the doubt crept in. What if William had been right? What if identity really was mutable? What if we were all just stories waiting to be rewritten by stronger voices? And I began to feel it. The subtle pull of the house's rhythm. The urge to straighten the curtains every morning at 8. The instinct to check the locks even though I hadn't locked the door in years. The way I caught myself whispering instead of speaking out loud. As if someone might be listening. As if noise itself was dangerous. And I knew then that this inheritance wasn't just property. It was pathology, a deeply ingrained behavioral legacy passed not through blood, but through environment, through patterns and rituals and shame disguised as structure. And the only way to survive it was to see it for what it was, to name it out loud, to look in the mirror and say, I am not him. I am not this house. I am not what was done. And some days I could say it, and some days I couldn't. I visited the town archives again, desperate now, not for facts, but for context, for some sliver of story that might explain how this had been allowed to happen. And I found nothing. You're seen. You're seen now. Because if nothing else, that was what I could give them, not justice, not absolution, but recognition, the simple, sacred act of looking, of witnessing, and not turning away. And that, I realized, was the true horror of the curtains. Not that they blocked light, but that they trained everyone inside to forget what light looked like IT began, as these things always do, with a sound so small it could have been dismissed as the house settling. An innocent phrase people use when they're afraid to admit that old wood and silence can conspire into something more sentient. But once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. A soft, rhythmic thud coming from beneath the floorboards, precisely 4 times each night, always at the same hour, 3:12 a.m., as if time itself had carved out a ritual, and at first, I told myself it was nothing, perhaps the plumbing, perhaps the wind, but the sound wasn't ambient. It had intention, like the slow, calculated knock of someone not seeking. Attention, but delivering a message, and the moment I acknowledged it, the entire house seemed to shift around it, the silence now filled with expectation. I lay in bed the first few nights, muscles tense beneath the thin blanket, heart pacing in time with the sound, and told myself not to go down there, not yet, because the house had already taken so much, and I wasn't sure I could survive what it had left to show me, but the need to know, to confirm, to see whatever it was, overpowered the dread. And so on the fifth night, when the sound returned, I followed it, barefoot and shivering despite the summer heat. I descended the stairs in darkness, afraid that any light might disturb whatever rhythm the house had established, and each step down felt like entering a deeper layer of someone else's memory, until I reached the basement door, now slightly ajar, though I knew I'd locked it, triple-latched it, even, and the air that met me was heavy, not stale but active like the breath of something waiting, and I forced the door open the rest of the way, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the cellar. It smelled of wet earth and metal, and I paused at the bottom of the stairs, letting my eyes adjust to the dark, and then I heard it again, thud, 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 exactly 4 beats, then nothing, as if the sound itself were testing my resolve, and I moved toward it, feet dragging over uneven concrete, until I reached the far wall. The one I'd always known had been hastily rebuilt after the fire, and now, with each passing night, I was more certain that someone, had been left behind it. I ran my hands across the surface, feeling for vibrations, and when I pressed my ear against the wall, I could hear breathing. Faint, impossibly faint, but undeniably human, and I recoiled as if shocked, stumbling backward into the shelves behind me, and something fell, clattering loudly, but the house didn't respond. The sound didn't resume, and I was left alone with A, pulse in my ears, and the growing certainty that I wasn't alone. I began documenting the sounds, marking the times, recording the intervals, and I noticed that every thud was followed by a small shift elsewhere in the house. A curtain in the parlor moved slightly. A door upstairs creaked open despite being latched. A photograph fell from the hallway wall. And I began to suspect that the sound wasn't just an echo of trauma. It was a cue, part of some long-forgotten routine the house remembered even, if no one else did. I tried to speak to the neighbors again, casually asking if they'd ever heard anything strange from this property back when it was occupied, and their responses were eerily uniform. Blank stares, polite deflection, one woman even changing the subject mid-sentence, as if her tongue couldn't form the words. And I realized that the silence surrounding the Addingtons had been so complete it had rewritten reality itself in this town, erased memories, trained people to look away, even from sound, and that made the noise more terrifying, because if no one had ever acknowledged it, how long had it been going on? Decades? And if it was real, and I was now certain it was, then what had everyone allowed to continue beneath their feet? One night, unable to bear any more, I returned to the basement with a hammer and began breaking the wall, not out of bravery, but desperation, needing to know whether the breathing was memory or fact, whether the thudding was a metaphor or a person. And behind the first layer of drywall, I found wood paneling, scorched and blackened at the edges, and behind that, stone, I clawed to the final layer with bleeding hands, splinters driving into my fingers, and when I removed the last piece, I expected to find a room. But it wasn't a room, it was a crawl space, barely large enough to lie down in, lined with decayed blankets and children's books warped by moisture, and scrawled across the stone walls what looked like charcoal were hundreds of tally marks, rows upon rows of tiny lines, some grouped, some crossed through, all of them evidence of time past, days or weeks or years counted by someone who had no other way to measure their existence. And in the corner was a rusted tin box, sealed with a nail bent into a makeshift lock. And when I pried it open, I found what remained of a small cassette recorder, its tape long destroyed by mold. But beside it was a final letter, addressed simply, to anyone who listens. And though the ink had run and many words were illegible, the parts that remained burned themselves into me. I don't remember what I sound like. I think I stopped talking years ago. Sometimes I hear my own breathing, and it scares me because it means I'm still here. He says I have to be quiet or the whole thing falls apart. I think I'm not the only one. I hear others in the walls. We don't speak, but we knock. That's how we know we're not alone. For knocks means still here. And I dropped the page, knees buckling beneath me, heart breaking in a way that had nothing to do with ghosts or ghouls and everything to do with the unbearable weight of human neglect, of a child so abandoned he became a rumor inside his own home. And I looked at the marks on the walls, the symbols of days spent in silence, and I understood now. This house wasn't haunted by the dead. It was haunted by the unheard, the unseen, the left behind, and the sound I'd heard every night was not. supernatural. It was memory insistent, a declaration that someone had lived and suffered here and would not be forgotten. After that night, the knocking stopped, and the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory, as if now that I knew, I was responsible too, and I didn't know what to do with that guilt except carry it, add it to the archive of inherited silence that now belonged to me. And I began leaving the basement door open, not out of courage, but respect, an invitation not for spirits, but for truths long buried. Because if no one else had listened, then IT was a strange draft that led me to it. A sudden shift in the hallway air as I passed the linen cupboard near the back stairwell, a coolness that didn't match the summer heat bleeding to the attic or the stagnant warmth of the rooms below. And when I paused, something subtle changed, not just in the air but in the house itself, as if it were exhaling after years of holding its breath. And I turned, slowly, tracing the sensation back to a seam in the wallpaper I hadn't noticed before. It was almost imperceptible, a thin vertical line running from floor to ceiling behind the cupboard, like a crack in a painting, and when I pressed my fingers against it, the wall gave slightly hollow and weak beneath the paper and plaster, and I knew in that cold, certain way that bypasses logic, that there was something behind it, something meant to be hidden not just from others, but from memory itself. I moved the cupboard aside, revealing a faint outline of a door, crudely framed, and sealed at its edges with nails that had rusted into the plaster, and there were no hinges, no knob, just a single latch in the center, worn smooth as if handled many times in secret. And for a moment I hesitated, staring at it as the house seemed to watch me back, the silence growing dense with anticipation. And then I opened it, not with force, but reverence, and behind it was a narrow staircase descending into darkness, so complete it felt like stepping into the throat of the house itself. I didn't remember this in any of the blueprints or renovation plans, and the dust covering the first few steps was untouched, undisturbed for decades. But as I descended with only a flashlight and a thud of my own heart to accompany me, I saw that the lower steps had been swept clean, not recently, but often enough to wear away the grime, and that alone sent a chill racing through me. Someone had used this space, had returned to it over and over while the rest of the house was forgotten. The stairs ended at a steel door, industrial, out of place in the rest of the house's ornate decay, and when I opened it, the flashlight caught the edge of something reflective, metallic, and I found myself inside a room no larger than a school classroom, windowless, lined with shelves, and at its center, a single hospital-style bed bolted to the floor, a table with restraints, a chair facing it, and on the walls, photographs, hundreds of them, each one pinned meticulously, showing the same child at different ages, in the same pose, sitting at the edge of the bed, expression blank, hands folded, always dressed in the same white shirt and gray trousers, as if time had frozen him into obedience. And then I understood this was not a room for hiding or for healing. It was a room for watching, for conditioning, a hidden annex built for control, and the reality of it hit me harder than anything I'd found before. William Addington hadn't just been cruel. He had been calculated, clinical, obsessive, and this room was the core of his method. The shelves were filled with notebooks, each labeled by year, and inside were logs, pages and pages of observations written in that same familiar, chilling hand. Subject responded to loss of light with immediate compliance. Meal withheld. Subject attempted communication. Punishment administered. Behavior now consistent with desired profile. Identity fully assumed. And the longer I read, the more I realized that what I was seeing was not just documentation. It was reprogramming, the systematic erasure of a child's self and the implantation of a new identity. And it wasn't just Robert Theo. It started earlier, with someone unnamed, prototype A, then subject B, each set of notes more refined, more precise, until finally, RT, Robert/Theo, most successful iteration. Identity replacement appears stable. Family accepts transition. Mother unresponsive to deviation. And I dropped the book, bile rising in my throat, hands shaking with the horror of what had been done here. The quiet violence, the scientific cruelty hidden behind silk curtains and family dinners. And I saw now that the Addington legacy was not simply one of silence, but of experimentation, of identity manipulation so grotesque it defied belief. And yet here it was, documented in ink, built into the bones of the house. On the far wall was a cabinet with Medical supplies, vials, syringes, sedatives long expired, and beneath it, a series of tapes labeled not with names, but with reactions, crying, refusal, resignation. And I didn't need to play them to hear the sound they held. I already had, in my sleep, in the quiet between knocks, in the way the walls seemed to vibrate when a house thought I wasn't looking. But it was what I found in the final drawer that undid me. A series of letters never sent, written in Margaret's trembling hand, addressed to no one, or perhaps to herself. I see what he is doing. I see it too late. I tried to stop him, but he told me I was confused, that the boys were safer this way, that their pain was a sign the process was working. He said identity is a burden they shouldn't have to carry. I believed him. I didn't want to, but I did. And now I can't remember which one I sang to, which one I buried. And I sank to the floor then, the weight of her words too much to bear, because the final horror was not just that a child had been erased. It was that love had become a tool in that erasure, that a mother's hands had been used not to protect but to pacify. And I wept, not for the dead, but for the living who had to carry this truth. And as I sat there, surrounded by photographs of a boy no one could name with certainty, I knew that the house had never needed to speak. It had always shown the truth, waiting for someone to open the door that wasn't always there. IT was only after I'd uncovered the hidden room, the steel-doored chamber of observation and compliance, the chamber that turned children into silence, that I began to see the house not just as a container of pain, but as a contagion, and the sickness that festered within its walls had not ended with the Addington name. It had rippled outward, a silent trauma, seeping into the lives of those who dared to come near it, especially the children, those closest in age to Robert and Theo, the ones who grew up at the house as a backdrop to their childhoods but never entered, who walked past it each day to school and heard the rumors, who never saw the boys play in the street, never heard their laughter, never received an invitation to birthday parties or sleepovers because the Addington boys didn't socialize. Not because they didn't want to, but because they weren't allowed to. And now, all these years later, I could see it plainly in the faces of those children, now grown, their expressions folding in on themselves when a house was mentioned, their voices clipped or overly polite when I pressed for answers. And it was in those silences I began to hear the truth louder than in any word spoken. I tracked them down one by one. Former classmates, now parents and teachers and postal clerks. And while many refused to speak, a few cracked beneath the weight of decades, and their stories came slowly, filtered through time and guilt and confusion. One man, Mark Addington, told me how, in 5th grade, Robert, who may have been Theo then, approached him at recess, stood too close and whispered, "I'm not me," then walked away as if nothing had happened. Another, Bethany Price, remembered being invited inside once for a study group only to be greeted at the door by Margaret Addington, pale and trembling, who said, "He's not well today," then handed her a typed list of math problems and closed the door. And Bethany never went back, not because she was afraid, but because something about the way the curtains moved after she left haunted her, like they weren't being drawn by hand, but by habit or by something that had been told to hide. And there were others, children who remembered the boys staring too long without blinking, who spoke in unison once during a school assembly, who flinched when called by name or corrected by teachers. And even now, those grown adults struggle to define the fear they felt, not a fear of harm, but of dissonance, of something so deeply wrong it couldn't be understood at the time, only felt in the pit of a child's stomach. And I realized that what the Addington house did to its own was only half the horror, the other. Half was the way it warped the world around it, made everyone complicit by default, turned silence into protection and protection into harm. I went to the elementary school, now shuttered, and found the old counselor's office, where in a dusty back cabinet someone had forgotten to remove a stack of handwritten reports, many of them yellowing and torn, and in those pages I saw the truth stitched together like an ugly quilt. Repeated referrals of emotional irregularity for Theo, notes about Robert's impulse control and mirror mimicry, incidents where neither child responded to their own name during roll call, but no one followed up, no one called the house more than once. And even when bruises were noted or strange absences accumulated, the reports ended in phrases like family requested privacy or child withdrawn voluntarily. And I realized that the system, like the town, had enabled the Addington legacy by valuing appearance over action, reputation over responsibility, and All the children who had brushed against that silence were left to carry its weight, unacknowledged and unexplained. I interviewed a retired teacher, Mrs. Langford, who taught them both in different years, and her eyes welled with tears when I showed her a photo of the boys. She pointed at one and said, "That's Robert," then shook her head, correcting herself. "No, Theo." God help me, I don't know anymore. We weren't supposed to ask. Their father, he made that clear. And she described how the boys never turned in creative writing assignments, how they'd submit blank pages or pages filled with numbers, code-like sequences that made no sense to anyone, and she'd always thought it was just eccentricity. But now she understood it for what it was, a cry for help in a language they were forced to invent because the world had refused to learn theirs. I found myself increasingly paranoid in those days, not a house, but of the reflection of its logic in the town. How everyone had learned to walk past pain without flinching. How easily a child's suffering could be reframed as a disciplinary issue. How quick we are to excuse what we don't understand. And I began to fear that the Addingtons weren't unique. They were just exposed, their story preserved in walls and logs and letters, while others like them dissolved into statistics unremarked. I returned to the house, to the attic, to that final photograph of the boys, one smiling faintly, the other distant, almost wary, and I looked at their eyes, tried to determine which was which, and it broke me that I couldn't, that even now, with all I had found, all I had felt, their identities still eluded certainty, and I understood then what the truest cruelty had been, not the punishments or the erasures, but the theft of self so complete that even memory could not undo it. The Addingtons had not merely failed to protect their children. They had dismantled them, and the town, through its polite refusal to interfere, had handed them the tools to do so, and now I was left with the fragments, not just of their lives, but of everyone they'd touched, every child who had walked away from them carrying a piece of confusion that would never quite resolve, every adult who would spend a lifetime wondering if the fear they felt had been real. And I want to tell them, all of them, that yes, it was real, it had a name, and it lived in that house at the edge of Mercy Lane, behind the curtains, behind the door that wasn't always there. And it wasn't a ghost. It was a system, a belief, a legacy of obedience and controlled dress as care. And the only way to break it was to speak it plainly, painfully, truthfully. So I wrote everything down, not as an expose or a confession, but as a reckoning. And I left copies of my manuscript at the library, at the school board, at the town hall. Not because I thought anyone would read it, but because someone had to put it there to push the silence back just enough for one voice, however small, to get through, and maybe, just maybe, some future child would feel afraid and not alone. And that would be enough that I don't remember exactly when I stopped feeling like a visitor in the Addington house, when the edges blurred and the floor stopped creaking beneath my weight, when the light in the hallway seemed to change not with the sun but with my footsteps, or when the rhythm of the place slipped beneath my skin like a pulse I'd always known but had forgotten how to hear. But by the time I read the final, unsent letter buried beneath a loose floorboard in the father's study, I understood that I was no longer just uncovering what had happened here. I was part of it. The letter was unsigned, written in a hand neither Margaret's nor William's. It began simply, "He never left. He just changed rooms." And that sentence alone unraveled everything, every assumption I clung to, every conclusion I'd drawn. Because if that was true, if the older Addington boy, the one we thought dead or vanished or replaced, had remained in this house, alive and hidden, then all my understanding of this place as a tomb was incomplete, and what followed in the letter was worse, not confessional, not accusatory, but observational. He doesn't sleep much. He sits by the fire even when it isn't lit. He practices speaking in different voices. Sometimes I think he forgets which one is real. I don't think he remembers my name. I don't think I remember it either. And I realized then that this wasn't a letter. It was a record, a continuation of the behavioral logs, written not by William, but by the survivor, the boy turned shadow, who had inherited not just the house but the method, the silence, the need to observe and control. I ran to the attic, heart thudding not with fear but with a horror of confirmation, and began pulling open every hidden panel, every drawer, every vent I hadn't yet explored. And that's when I found it, a small hatch in the attic, floor so perfectly blended in the wood that I'd stepped over a dozen times without noticing, and inside was a ladder leading not down but sideways into the crawl space above the upper floor, narrow and thick with insulation, and at the end of that passage, a room no larger than a closet, padded with old blankets, a makeshift lamp powered by extension cords, and a journal. Still open, still damp from the sweat of recent hands. And I touched the paper like it might bite, afraid of what I already knew. Because the journal wasn't old, wasn't dusty. It was current, written in a steady mechanical hand, and the last entry was dated 2 nights ago. He walks like me now. He listens the way I did. The house speaks to him. I think it's time. And I stumbled backward, breath caught in my throat, because this meant that someone, some version of one of them, was still here, not just as memory or metaphor, but physically breathing, watching, waiting, and in the dusty air of that narrow passage. I smelled something I hadn't noticed before, not decay, but warmth, like someone had just left or was still nearby. I retraced my steps, closing the hatch behind me, heart racing, and every creak of the house now felt purposeful, every draft of breath, and I couldn't tell whether I was afraid of being found or finding him. Because what would I say? What could I say to a person who had been buried not beneath earth, but beneath identity, who had lived as someone else for so long that even mirrors couldn't help him anymore? That night, I sat in the parlor, every light off, watching the staircase like a sentry, listening for footsteps that never came, and somewhere around 3 a.m., I whispered into darkness, "You don't have to hide anymore." And the silence that followed was not empty, but listening, considering, and I don't know how I knew, but I felt it, that he was there, somewhere behind the walls, not malevolent, not dangerous, just waiting for the right cue. And I understood in that moment that this house didn't need ghosts because it had him, a living embodiment of its history, a keeper of its rituals, someone who had folded himself into an architecture so thoroughly that tearing down the walls might kill him too. The next morning, I found my suitcase packed by the front door, not by me, and with nothing missing, nothing damaged, just ready, and I understood what it meant. This was never going to be my house, not truly. It had chosen its heir decades ago, and now it was simply showing me the way. Out! I stood in the foyer for what felt like hours, hand on the banister, looking back at the room where Margaret once played the violin, where Theo or Robert once sat with a book on his lap, eyes hollow with knowledge he should never have had. And I whispered again, this time to the house, or to whoever still listened within it, "You were seen. You are remembered. But I cannot be you." And I stepped outside, the sun too bright, the air too clean, and for the first time since arriving, I felt not like I was leaving a place, but like I was escaping one. And yet, even as I write this now, from a borrowed apartment miles away, I still feel him, the boy who never left, the boy who became silence itself, watching not with eyes but with memory, and I wonder, was it kindness that kept him hidden, or fear? Was it choice or programming? And worse, if the house made him, and he remained in it, what did that make me, now that I had lived there, now that I had listened to its rhythm, adopted its routines? Even for a time? I don't know. I only know this. Some houses remember, but the Addington house became memory itself. And memory, when left unspoken for too long, begins to write its own truth, through walls, through silence, through the children who were never allowed to leave that I left the Addington house behind, or at least I told myself I did. But the truth is, it followed me, not in footsteps or shadows, but in habits, in thoughts, in the way silence began to shape my days. Even after I returned to life, I thought I'd paused, not abandoned. I moved into a modest apartment with open windows and no curtains at all, just sunlight pouring in from dawn to dusk. And still, every evening at exactly 6:30, my hands would twitch toward the windows, ready to draw something closed, and I'd catch myself, standing in the living room with nothing to hold, and the emptiness would throb, not from absence, but from memory rehearsed too long to simply forget. I stopped locking doors after the second week, not because I felt safe, but because I couldn't bear the sound of keys and locks, the way they echoed like footsteps down long hallways, and sometimes, when the wind moved a little too evenly through cracks in the windows, I'd hear 4 soft knocks in my sleep and wake up breathless, half convinced I was still in the attic, still beneath the floorboards, still part of the story the house refused to let go. I kept the letters, of course, all of them, the ones from Theo and Robert and Margaret, and even the father's cruel records, not because I wanted to remember, but because forgetting felt like another betrayal. And sometimes I'd reread a single line, just one, "I think I'm not the only one," and sit there in the dark, holding the paper like it might warn me, like it might speak if I listened hard enough. I tried to tell others what happened, tried to explain what the house was, what it did, But every word I chose felt too pale, too thin, like translating grief into a language no one else had ever spoken. And their responses, "That's awful. You should talk to someone. Have you thought about writing it all down?" only deepened the ache, because I had written all down, every detail, and yet it still lived inside me like marrow unshakable. I tried burning the manuscript once, set a light in a metal basin on the balcony, watched the pages curl and blacken. But the next morning, I found a copy neatly stacked on my kitchen table, the ink faintly smudged, as if someone had handled it with damp fingers, and I laughed then, not out of fear, but surrender, because it had never been about the paper, the words, the evidence. The story was alive now, not in the house, but in me, and that was something no fire could erase. Months passed, and yet I found myself slipping, eating meals in silence, folding my clothes into perfect stacks, checking the time obsessively at the start of each hour. And one night, without realizing it, I arranged the furniture in my bedroom to mirror the Addington layout. Bed against the north wall, desk beneath the window, chair facing the door, and it wasn't until I caught my reflection in the glass that I saw it. Not the boy from the photographs, not the man I had once been, but something in between, someone trying to keep the past from leaking out, even as it bled to the seams. I began drawing the curtains, not because I wanted to, but because it felt wrong not to, like leaving the windows open was an invitation for something to return. And each time I did it, the fabric swayed just slightly, even with the windows closed, as if remembering its purpose, and I whispered apologies without knowing who they were for. Sometimes I imagined returning, walking through the rusted gate again, unlocking the front door, calling out softly just to see if someone answered. But I never did, because I knew that going back wouldn't be a visit. It would be surrender, and the house would recognize me not as an intruder, but as one of its own. And still I think of the boy, whichever one he became, still somewhere in those walls, still pacing, still writing, still watching. And I wonder if he ever knew I was there, if he ever saw me as a threat or a witness or something else entirely. And I wonder, too, if the house let me leave, or if it simply gave me space, trusting I'd return when the silence grew too loud. I've stopped trying to name what happened there.